Whoops, come on. There we go. Welcome to Evolution Hour here on our rather hot day in Spokane in the wee hours of the morning. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack. WordPress.com is the website. Yay! Remember everything at the website, and I put a link into that every single show. All of those PDFs, multiple book length stuff. Share it. It's all open access. Everybody can glom onto the stuff. It's got material on the history of creationism. There's stuff on the intelligent design movement. There's material on human evolution, and there's a lot of stuff in there. 3 Macroevolutionary Episodes book that's sort of the baby version of The Rocks Were There, and Evolution Slam Dunk that have been more recent and more detailed stuff. So that's material from 2004 or earlier, but it's still really neat, wonderful stuff, and all freebie access stuff, just in case you can't plop down some money for the books. Now, let me put our little friends up from our patrons, without whom life would be much more complicated than it is here. Okay, come on, get that little thing over there. Voila. Hello. And our various colleagues, researchers and assistant researchers and friends and so forth and so on, who contribute in spite of all the ups and downs and ins and outs. That's a thumbs up of support for the old RJ, and I very, very, very much appreciate it every single month. So thank you, all of that. And given the fact that there are disasters and things that can happen that are calls upon people's money and all the rest, I totally appreciate how the help that you can give, that you're still plugging away with it. So now we will get back to our point of issue, the show today. Finally finished off chapter 2 of Titans, our creationist little tome. They dangle kind of like a little light thread. They take a jab at Edward Cope and his, quote, belief that non-white races of humans were more ape-like, a belief shared by most evolutionists of the day, unquote, which again cited more material that's in-house apologetics. They put a 2020 video by the co-author Tay, which I'll be putting a link up to, and which basically retreads all the same tropes that you find in the creationist literature, the Ota Bengi example, and all the rest. It's the usual. And then a little bit of Sarfati, 20, which I'll also be putting a link up to. That's actually fairly superficial and also is relying on Tay as one of the link sources in there. We'll be delving into more detail on this in Rocks Were There Volume 2, which is on that whole bit of what sort of racism was going on in the 19th century, how much of it was operating in the Darwin world versus the non-Darwin world, and in particular, how much of it is relating to religious perceptions. There's an awful lot of stuff on that, and Sarfati and Bergman and others that have weighed in on this subject have just avoided the details like the plague. And it ranks from how they've downplayed 19th century polygenist racists like Louis Agassiz, who I've mentioned previously on the show, who went positively ballistic when he saw black people when he came to America from Switzerland. Parochial background, poor Louis. But also the very substantial racism that was the case with Henry Morris and those Southern creationists that formed the early stages of the young earth creationist movement. Nowadays, at least a positive is that level of racism is no longer acceptable within young earth creationist apologetics. So they just kind of tidy everything up and pretend like they never had it to begin with. So a lot of revisionism going on. We're going to be alluding to all of that in the new book. Then Sarfati and Tay make a brief reference to the, quote, most likely fraudulent Ica stones, unquote, which are these, not most likely, they are fraudulent depictions of dinosaurs that are concocted in the 20th century and more recently, but are not actually ancient things showing actual dinosaurs being depicted on Peruvian artwork. And again, they cite their own CMI in-house source, Doyle from 2016, which I'll be putting a link up to. We're going to have a whole fun section on that in Rocks Were There Volume 2, because the Ica stones and the Akambaro figures and the various people circulating around that, and particularly an awful lot of creationists, especially Kent Hovind, still think that they're okay, as does Eric Hovind. So outside of the little narrow CMI box, people at AIG and ICR and the Kent Hovind realm and the bottom feeders now with Carl Baugh have a very different attitude on this, but Sarfati and Tay don't really deal with that much, even later on in the book when they get back to it. Then their concluding sections of the chapter is kind of an admitting the obvious, which is that there was a revolution in dinosaur paleontology, jump-started in the 1960s by Ostrom's paper on the connections between birds and the new fossil Deinonychus that they had found. Big deal. And I'll be putting a link up to that paper so you can take a dive back to 1969 and see one of the seminal works on dinosaur paleontology, because the details of Deinonychus were connecting up to the birds in a way that hadn't been linked up in anywhere near so rigorous a way. And of course, that began to percolate through the literature, and they allude, Sarfati and Tay allude to some of the more general works on the subject. Robert Backer, his stuff in the 70s and 80s that was developing the warm-blooded dinosaur model and then dinosaur connections to birds and all of that, and a more recent edition of Gregory Paul's book that unfortunately I won't be able to put links up to Backer and Paul, and then a little brief mention in a footnote to Alan Fiducia, who no doubt, from what I've glanced ahead on it, will be playing a pivotal role in their attempt to demolish the bird-dinosaur connection. The part 2 issue is a cutie, because this one is a little sidebar on my old reptile-mammal transition stuff. I encountered a Twitter creationist, Ed Maxwell, minor leaguer. I don't think he's done much in the way of stuff except gripe on the internet. And he's one of these hyper overconfident Dunning-Kruger types who thinks that he just demolishes the nasty evolutionist right and left. And so he thinks he can do kill shots, as he calls them, on evolution. And his main obsession when he was prattling with me was about the soft tissue issue. And he was bringing up the stuff I was expecting, because, of course, we're putting a great big section on the whole creationist misuse of soft tissue in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. And so I was entirely familiar with what little smattering of stuff he was being presented. And from what I could tell from his argument, he was channeling somebody secondarily, most probably Brian Thomas at ICR, because he's the big offender, the most prolific of the people blathering on about this stuff. Anyway, I tried to wean Maxwell off of this issue of the soft tissue thing, because it was just basically repeating the stuff that Thomas and others had done. I wanted to get him on the issue of transitional forms of the reptile-mammal transition, and at which point he decided to fire at moi, quote, did not have to look far, but found this paper casting doubt on the accepted evolution paradigm. Quote, the synapsid adaptive landscape is different from both extant reptiles and mammals, casting doubt on the reptilian model for early synapsid axial function, unquote. Well, I was kind of happy that he didn't lob Woodmarap at me, because that's the typical one that if you're just doing a quick internet search, you're most likely to come up with. But no, instead he came up with a paper from 2021 by Jones, which I'll be putting the link up to via Science Direct. You'll be able to read the whole bloody thing. And what they're talking about, that synapsid axial behavior, has to do with the spinal column and stuff. And the way reptiles move versus the way mammals move. All the paper was doing was saying that the development in synapsids was showing a divergence from the format that's found in later, more conventional diapsids, which are not close cousins, as close a cousins as we find with mammals, to the synapsids. At no point, and you can see their charts and all that yourself, at no point are they challenging the evolutionary paradigm, the therapsids as the transitional form between reptiles and mammals and all the rest. It's a really interesting little paper, which this Maxwell guy clearly hadn't read all that closely. So I'll be putting the link up to that on there. Now, next chapter in Sarfati is going to be on what is a dinosaur. And drum roll, they're actually going to start mentioning some actual technical literature. So far, they've barely scratched into some old 19th century stuff, which we mentioned to earlier regarding those early dinosaur finds. And of course, this Ostrom paper that adds on to it. Just a slight dithering. At the moment, then, they haven't yet directly misrepresented the content of a paper. We're going to see whether or not that's going to hold up as they start dribbling material in the next chapter. What I'm really salivating on is when they get down to specific taxa and to try to cross-measure that against the creationist paradigms about dinosaur families and all the rest. And we'll encounter that as we go and find out how many sources that they got. At the moment, they're still running a little over one source per page. And the vast majority, close to 80% of it, is creationist material. And there's going to be more creationist material that they're bringing out in the next chapter. So although we're going to finally get to see a little more technical papers, it's not a lot. So we'll find out about how that's all going. Here, we're slogging along in now this roller coaster heat wave in Spokane. It was in the 90s, and then it got cooled down into the 70s and 80s. Now we're back into the 90s again, and we're going to be in that mode for a few more days, and we're just kind of roller coastering through August on that. It's murky because also have some fires in the area. My brother had to come over and shag out at the house because he was forced to evacuate. Finally, he's got back up to the place. So far, there's been no fire threat directly to the little condo that he's living in, but could change at any moment because they haven't quite contained all of those little fires. So everything is kind of dicey one way or the other. I think I may have sprung a leak with my washing machine downstairs. Had a little bit of a pool of damp down there, which I thought might have been a backflow from the old defunct bathroom in the basement. But I suddenly dawned on me, I wonder if it might have been a bit of a leak from the washing machine. So I'm going to have to pull that out and do some analysis on there to find out whether or not it's gotten unloose. It was slightly off center from where it was when I last did the laundry. I don't remember any water puddle when I went down there, but it may have been something from there that got dislodged because the machine had wiggled a little bit, but we'll have to check on all of that. Well, we'll get across all those pages when we come to them. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, continuing work on Rocks Were There Volume 2, and also just finished up chapter 7 of Paralogs of Fog 2, which we're visiting Lincoln Island, where Captain Nemo has his little base down there in the Pacific Ocean, and pulling together all my little threads and material for things to come. So we're keeping busy here in the heat. It's 82 degrees in my den, and it's 12:30 in the morning, so I can get you some ideas. It can get a little bit murky. Because I'm a night owl, I can wait until it's in the wee hours of the morning and it's starting to get a bit cooler, and so I can handle the sleeping zone because I have an air conditioner in the back bedroom that my niece and her husband put in last year to cool things down for that very purpose, and it works pretty good on that. So yeah, we muddle along compared to the problems people have having to, the houses that got burned down. A huge number of people have been displaced, and it's just been a mess in here. And of course, all the big fires up in Canada, that's another area that we've got, and people still counting the bodies out in Maui, and then troubles with heat waves in Europe and some of these other places, flooding in other zones from torrential rains that can come up. That's more fun and games that are going on in our climate challenged world. Keep an eye on all of that. Follow the sources on that. It's an interesting little thing that I try to keep track of, that I began keeping track of for the project. National Center for Science Education started doing this around the same time I did, which was to note that the creationist subculture is often intersecting with the climate denialists, and that the methodology, from my point of view, they're indistinguishable. You have a small group of activists who are spreading the viewpoints far and wide, and then various people, often with scientific degrees. I think the average climate denier that you find on Twitter will have probably better credentials than the average anti-evolutionist you find on Twitter. These are often very active ones that are lobbing their arguments on Twitter so that people can see them, and not typically referencing technical papers directly, but putting charts and stuff that they've glommed onto in there. It's an area that I'm following a bit of at the source level, just to be able to cross-check things on that. And that's going to be part of the future book that Jackson and I will be doing, which is on the methodology and mindset of conspiracy thinkers and pseudoscience people of that type, and the spectrum of how stupid is it versus how big of a problem is it. And clearly, anti-vax sentiments and climate denialism bump into policy issues far more directly and far more dangerously than anything that you're going to be getting in flat Earth or even young Earth creationism. If young Earth creationist enablers ever got into power, the Trump administration didn't take this mode. They were too busy putting Federalist Society anti-abortion judges on the Supreme Court and the federal courts to bother about that. And Trump himself apparently is a scientific illiterate, so this is not a button issue for him. But in principle, if you ever had like an American Taliban style thing where the Kent Hovind style creationism could get in charge in some states and dictate what was going to be taught in the schools and get funding cut for science work in that area, it could spool out of control in no time at all, just as it did in any other totalitarian state from the Nazis in the 1930s and then the Soviet Union as well. So keep posted on that little puppy. I wish a lot of these issues were being asked of political people better. The one thing that came up as a hot button item in the Republican debate with Vivek Ramachandran, whatever his name is, and then the various other people there, Chris Christie and so forth, on climate change, indicated that there was nobody there who could be regarded as a seriously informed person on climate. And Vivek went overboard by saying he was the only one there that wasn't bought and paid for by the oil industry and all that. And he called climate change a hoax and all of that. Yeah, sure. Right. The thing that annoys me about all of the coverage of this, Face the Nation, Meet the Press, and the like, is that nobody is quizzing these people on their source methods. The far use you get is simply the policy level of what their position is, and maybe asking for their viewpoint on a policy issue, but not how are they bumping into the data floor, where they're getting their information from, who are they relying on, how do they fact check it. That's the issue of the methodology angle. And I urge everybody who interacts both at local media and also with more national media to bring this to their attention. Just today, I couldn't resist pointing out that the major interview programs, their coverage of this was never asking any source issues. And that's where they're screwing up. That's, if you want to look at how a climate denier manages to believe what they do, it's exactly the same procedure as how Dwayne Gish would come to be so wrong, or Kent Hovind, or Eric Hovind, or Ken Ham, or Andrew Snelling, or Philip Johnson, or Steve Meyer, or fill in the blank. And it's exactly the same methodology as to how anti-vaxxers like Dr. Merkala on the Epoch Times venues, or the ones that I'm seeing popping up on Twitter, it's all the same bad methodology. One bad method to rule them all. I think that may be the motto, little pun on one ring to rule them all from Lord of the Rings. That could be the motto of one bad method to rule them all, that there is a single uniform bad methodology that is the reason why people who believe things that really aren't true can manage to do that. And you can identify it, and I would suggest combat it by probing at that source level to expose the degree to which the person in question doesn't actually know nearly as much as they think they do, that they are relying on unreliable sources. If you can pry it loose from them, what sources they do. Robert Kennedy Jr., for example, in some of the spiels that he was doing in the Capitol a few years back, in his early stage of being an anti-vax and mercury is causing autism bit, was relying on an extremely narrow data field, and he's not improved since. Rand Paul, another one that pops up into this area, and of course you've got the Marjorie Taylor Greens and that crowd that have their own little network. But if media are never exploring that angle, merely pointing out that they are inaccurate and saying the scientific consensus says such and so, is not viscerally introducing the audience to the fact that the person is screwing up because their methodology is never bumping into the data, and they're taking sources that are not in fact legitimate sources, but they think they're okay because they don't know how to or have never fact-checked them. And we can't afford that level of methods incompetence anymore. The challenges that we're facing and the need to do neat stuff like flying into space and doing all the fun stuff that I was expecting that we would be doing more of back when I was seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1969. All of that depends on having that sound methodology. And the young people, way younger than this old fart, but the age of my co-author Jackson, who's in his 20s, the future, we'd like it to be nice. What future I have left, hopefully many, many decades, knock wood, I want it to be in an environment where I'm not broiling up like an old Twilight Zone episode gone amok. And all of that's going to involve our elected leaders grounding their arguments on sound evidence and being able to defend in public to us, their employers, how they arrive at these things. And too many politicians are used to tap dancing around matters. In our local race, try to pin down Kathy McMorris Rogers on her position on climate change. In the debates that she's had, and she's involved in debates every election, it's not hit properly, and it's not followed up on the fact that you can't figure out what her position is on things. Well, we can't tolerate that anymore. And you're always facing the difficulty if you've got a large amount of the electorate that's not engaging in sound methods. I would suggest that somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene was able to win re-election in her district in Georgia because most of her constituents are no more methods grounded than she is. So how would they know? Hi, Purple. Greetings, sentient beings. Yes, I'm doing a nice little rant here on the need for source methods and why it's really important beyond the case study of creationism, but also for all intelligent discourse. And that we can't let politicians fiddle-faddle on bad method. And they've been doing this for all practical purposes as long as you can imagine. Some people are evidence-based to some extent, but it's always been in the shadows. And normally you would have parties that would have a compensatory mechanism that would start paying attention to data at some level in the frame for that. And that's why you would see George Bush, the elder, the first George Bush. Yes, you're winding down for the night. Yeah, it's been hot here in Spokane. I imagine in a lot of other areas, people have got need to kind of relax in the wee hours. But George Bush would be unacceptable in today's Republican Party because he was way too okay with the issue of climate change and the need to do something about it. Democrats would not have that much difficulty. Progressives that are not yet in an ascendancy enough to be able to really push their positions, but they would be wanting much more forceful action than what appeared to be the case. But then Biden comes along and comes up with a pretty aggressive climate policy and manages, for the moment at least, to keep it financed and run around Kevin McCarthy's need to shut the government down because his nutballs want to shut the government down. Fortunately, Biden, old man, old fart, too old for the job, well, he seems to be able to work excessively well in negotiating on these matters. And so I'm not too bad about it. I'm okay with it. Members of Congress had advisors and sometimes listened to people in the fields. Yeah, that's been the true of both of the political parties at one point or another. You certainly had scientific illiterates knocking around in there. But look at the difference of somebody like a James Watt, who was expecting the end times. And this was back in the 1980s in the Reagan administration. And his kind of wacky view as he was Secretary of Commerce, I think, or the Department of the Interior, I think it was. At any rate, it was quite a flap that blew up around Watt. And I'll put him in the little thing in here, James Watt. And he had to resign. He was out. Come on, there we go. Here, there we go. Enter. Biden may have been physically stumbled a couple times, but no question he's mentally sharp. Yeah. That I agree completely on that. And of course, we have to remember in terms of verbal, he's a stutterer. He has freely acknowledged the fact that he's never stopped being a stutterer. So some of the little verbal gaps that he occasionally does, that's from that. As for the physical tumbling, he is, after all, got 11 years on me. And I have fallen down my steps in the going down to the driveway 3 times last year because my ankle would suddenly give out, particularly if I was in like a snow boot or something where it was that suddenly I go bloop and I do a gainer down there. One time I banged my head right up against the concrete thing. So this stuff can happen, just as Mitch McConnell can have a little mini stroke in there if you're older. Some people clearly get to be a little bit memory lossy, as the California senator was, and she really should resign now and not bother about seeing out her term. That's a matter of circumstances going on. But what do you do with somebody like George Santos, who is nowhere near my age, or Marjorie Taylor Greene, clearly nowhere near my age, who between the two of them could not make a half-wit? And Santos should resign and have been kicked out. Marjorie Taylor Greene should never have got to the point where she could have gotten in the Congress. These are people who are just screwballs, and yet we've got them. And you do have ideologues on the Democratic side. You've got definitely very pro-Palestinian and not particularly keen on Israel, Ocasio-Cortez of New York. But those are ideological dogmatisms, not methods issues on matters of mere scientific fact. I think that Ocasio-Cortez could be persuadable on policy matters in a way that Marjorie Taylor Greene can't. And so you get into a very, very different dynamic on this. We've had, of course, scientific illiterates, and we've had bigots, and we've had nincompoops in the Congress going back for all through its period. And it has its ups and downs. If you look at some of the people that were furious about not abolishing slavery back in the 19th century, or some of the Southern racists in the period when Jim Crow was being instituted in the late 19th century, and some of the people in who were rubbing up against the KKK in the 1920s, sure as hell, yes, we've got people in there that if you shake up the bag with Matt Gaetz as the exemplar, they're going to shake out the same end. But there were also a broader level of statesmen and people who will pay attention to some of the facts. An example of John McCain, who was a feisty, very conservative person, certainly an ideologue. Liz Cheney, yet another one of that type, who her politics is way too conservative for me. But at least by the second impeachment time, it was beginning to dawn on her that something was screwball with Trump. And so all of this has to do with what voters do, and young voters who need to be registered, who need to be, where needed, active in their local politics, who need to vote at all levels of government. Don't just think you can trot out for senator and governor and president and not pay attention to who's on the school board, who's on the city council, who are controllers and insurance commissioners and all of that. So it's up to us, not some cloud cuckoo land vapor, to be the people who are vetting the people that we elect. And it's not always the case. I have never voted for Kathy McMorris Rodgers, and I think she should be voted out. And as yet, we haven't been able to do that. Maybe I will live to see the day when Kathy McMorris Rodgers will be replaced by a Democrat, and maybe it'll be this time around in 2024. We'll see. But it's a fairly conservative district. In-town Spokane has quite many pockets of liberal because we're one of the big population centers in the east side of the state. But go out to the suburbs and then out to the rural area in the district, and it's Trump country. And so I'm not holding my breath that we'll be able to change that, but it's one election at a time and one spot at a time. Just as now we really have to pay close attention to the Electoral College and how the votes distribute at the electoral level, state by state by state, because we know from 2016 that just because you win the popular vote by a big margin, which Hillary Clinton did, she won the popular vote by just about the margin that the polls and projections were suggesting. Where it screwed up was just enough states tipped the scale for Trump to get in. And I cannot guarantee that that cannot happen again, not with the close elections that we've had in Arizona and elsewhere, where sometimes it's down to a few thousand votes. So it's up to us, kids. And the younger generation, who there's still way too many people that aren't voting. And as we saw in between 2016 and 2020, there were like 65 million people voting for Trump in 2016 and 75 million have voted for him in 2020. So new voters coming onto the field are not necessarily going to vote on the side of not stupid. So that means you still have to maintain a lot of get out and vote and make the vote known, because the stakes are so effing high. So there's my little rant on the thing. I'm old enough to remember not only the history of politics in my lifetime, which is starting to congeal in my head around the Eisenhower years on, but as a historian, I'm aware of the political ups and downs in all the time previous to that. And I had never, I met some accelerationists, but I think they're just as stupid. Yes. Are those, is that the, define that, Jeremy. Are we talking about accelerated radioactive decay crowd? If so, I haven't really met, other than just doctrinal creationists and that, I've never really bumped into too many people online who are big defenders of that position. A lot of them don't know enough about it to be dissenters, but give us a clarification. Young people are, I hope they turn out large enough. Yeah. Oh yeah, there's more than enough people in most districts to be able to resolve all this if you have the voter turnout. We still have upwards close to 100 million people who are old enough to vote who don't. And in Washington state, we have a mail-in voting system. We've had it for years, so we don't have to worry about waiting in line. We don't care what the bloody weather is. I get my little voter pamphlet and I get my little voter thing. I fill it out. I typically have worked out who I'm going to be voting for well in advance of voter day. And then I toddle up a nice little walk up to the park, drop it in the little box up next to the library, and it's done. Far leftists who think that electing far right will bring about the workers' revolution. Yeah, they are effing stupid. You get this same circumstance. In some history of Germany leading up into the Third Reich, I think is kind of relevant here. And so to show you that this is something that's not connected even to leftism, this notion that, oh, you need to shake everything up to get things resolved. There was the, I think his name was Stresemann, who seriously thought, because the indemnities that were put on Germany were so intense, that he was thinking that if he made life so visibly miserable for Germans in paying off this huge indemnity, that it would make the allies feel sorry for them and let up. That didn't happen. And then you had the ones who were fiddle farting with Hitler, thinking that they could control him, that they could manipulate him, that he would defer to their better judgment. And he gets in power, and he ends up killing all of the ones who were doing that in the various purges and assassinations and things, clean the decks to make sure that only their side comes in there. Yeah, the idea that the workers' revolution is going to come out. I'm not a socialist. Let me be clear about it. I'm not an unrestricted capitalist either, because I also know the difficulties of that kind of thing. And so I'm looking for policies that actually work and how to accomplish it. It's done through regulations and tax codes. It's done through cooperative efforts at state and local levels. Most of the time, the grocery store that I'm shopping in is owned by the workers. And some of it's unionized and some not, because they own the store. The workers are all part of that. I think that's highly appropriate. I think there could be legal changes that make it much more easy to do that in all ways of life, not just grocery stores. There's also some things that I think should be nationalized. Why we don't have a national health system is just plain dumb, but we know why we don't have a national health system. Try ramming that through Congress. There's even conservative Democrats who will not be able to pull that one off. The difficulty that we had to get the Obamacare through, which was a miracle of complicated, clunky compromise. But given how many presidents tried to get this done from Teddy Roosevelt on, it took 100 years before Obama and Nancy Pelosi, who really knew how to count votes, to get that through. That's certainly a part of it. It was in the cause of World War II being that the punitive treaty. That was a great element of it. We have to remember that everybody was screwing up after World War I. There were policy decisions, and a lot of these things were economic policy decisions. Yes, exactly. Grocery store, Rosars is much better than the non-employee ones that I go through occasionally, because not everybody has everything. Rosars went employee-owned. Oh, gosh, it must have been at least 10 years ago. It's been quite a long time. Albertsons, there's still some in Spokane. They're owned by a bunch of Mormons, although there have been things there. Didn't the German central bank solve the hyperinflation before the Great? Oh, yeah, that's the hyperinflation thing was a very complicated structure that was going on. And by hyperinflation, the only places that have had that bad recently are like in Zimbabwe, where everything went out the window. That's when you start printing up $1 trillion notes or trillion whatever notes. The hyperinflation got spinning out of control in the early 1920s. And the problem with it for the long term was that it absolutely vaporized middle-class savings. So it just gutted that whole environment for them. And it graced the wheels. When the Depression hit, then people didn't have any savings to fall back on. They didn't have a social security system and other kinds of things to work on. And so that was part of the contribution to the rise of Hitler. But we have to remember, Hitler was never voted into power. He was appointed into power. Other ones actually were. Mussolini was voted into power in Italy in 1922. So he was the old kid on the block when Hitler came along in 1933. But there were a lot of bad economic policies that were going on in a variety of areas. The Bank of England, Montague Norman, who was the head of the Bank of England, and he was desperate to keep the British pound at $5 per pound after World War I. And what that resulted in was a big gold drain that was landing in the Federal Reserve. And when the stock market crash hit, the Federal Reserve, the old guard that had founded the thing, had died off, and there were new directors in there that didn't quite think this through. And so they were waiting for a rainy day. They didn't want to fritter away their gold that they were accumulating. So they kind of kept it in reserve. Meanwhile, the rainy day, people were drowning outside in the Depression. The French, of course, were still insisting that the Germans had to pay their reparations. The Germans were having a devil of a time to do that. And the hyperinflation period and the troubles after that, and then the Depression didn't help. So it was a whole bunch of dumb policies that was going on during this period. And that means that as we now know, and the people that came along after World War II who had learned a few lessons, and the people that were active in the Republican Party of Reagan and others who knew these, there was an internationalism to the Reagan era. He had his problems on Central American policy and the bits with the Iran-Contra affair and their notions on AIDS. There was a lot of things that were problematic about the Reagan administration, but their awareness of the importance of international relationships and that the go-it-alone modality of isolationists won't work. We have to do things cooperatively and pay attention to what other countries are doing so that we can all progress together and not avoid trade wars, the free tradeism. There's been a resurgence of protectionism, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, not ungrounded in terms of behavior, because we know that countries try to put up barriers to give themselves an advantage. But I still have an awful lot of the Milton Friedman approach to this, which is that the illness, the cure is worse than the disease. That however troublesome it is, when a country skews their economic policies to help their local industry, that in the long run, the one thing you can't do to resolve that is to set up giant tariff barriers and tariff wars that strain trade, because that was another factor that helped screw up the period that led into Hitler. The Hawley Smoot tariff that the Hoover administration put in to protect America from foreign competition only slowed down trade even more, which caused even more depression to come along. So a lot of factors are involved in there. The notion that there's some simple little magic wand that anybody can do. The left-wingers would have the notion, all we need to just have is the revolution. But their notion on that accelerationist thing, the idea that you make things so bad that the workers will then rise up and it'll make utopia, no. Things got really bad in the Tsarist time that led into the Soviet Revolution. Did that bring about a utopia? No, it brought about gulags and Stalinism and all the rest and the illusion of progress, but in many respects, no. So history tells us a hell of a lot of things in this area, and that procedure just won't work. Inflation is a problem. You no longer have room to print enough zeros on the bill. Yeah. And here's the thing that I think is important, and everybody that encounters people who are too young to remember the history directly need to be reminded about it. I'm an old fart, and any old farts here who have lived through the 1970s experienced the stagflation that was occurring. It occurred when Nixon, in his often bungled economic policies, saw inflation bubbling up to 4%. And he decided, we're going to resolve this. We're going to institute wage and price controls, which turned a 4% inflation rate into an 11% inflation rate. And the government, with the divested power structures and the squabbles over what programs were being, Nixon had instituted a lot of expansion. Most of the people who complain about the Great Society spending are actually arguing about the spending that was done under Nixon as he expanded the Environmental Protection Agency and a whole bunch of other stuff. But anyway, inflation just continued increasing and the economy was kind of stalling, and that's where the stagflation came in. And I think, if memory serves me, at the time when it finally gets nipped in the bud by Reagan and Volcker, we're flirting with 15% inflation. That's double what we were seeing in this little recent spurt because of the pandemic ramp up. Had nothing to do with Biden spending policies or anything else. Old fart. So you turned 58 last month. Anyway, when you get an inflation that's that high and that entrenched to where we would be making a point, you might as well buy that new thing today, because if you wait too much longer, it's going to be even more expensive. So appliances, television sets, there was a whole bunch of stuff where there was a churning thing, which only fueled more inflation, and it just kept cycling around. It sank the Ford administration that came in after Nixon resigned, and it sank, along with the Iran embassy hostage situation, sank the Carter administration as well. None of them were willing to bite the bullet. Even though Carter had a deregulation side, they broke up AT&T during Carter administration. There was a deregulation of gas prices, natural gas prices, another thing during his administration. So there was a lot of what we would consider conservative Republican policies going on in the Carter administration as well. But anyway, the inflation wasn't going down, and Reagan and Volcker both agreed that you needed to have a double whammy bang, between fiscal and monetary policy, which that squeezes it out. And they knew, and they were publicly stating that they knew this was going to produce a recession. Fasten your seatbelts, kid. We're going to have a bumpy ride. And it was very bumpy. And the economy slowed down. We had 20% interest rates at banks. We had a 10% unemployment recession to squeeze that inflation out. But once that was done, the Federal Reserve now had people in charge where they were going, okay, we're not going to do that again. And from that point on, it's the 2% inflation target and things that have been ever since. Now, there's still a quibble as to some people are saying, maybe a 3% inflation rate's kind of okay to go with, but they're still technically committed to the 2% inflation rate. I would recommend, if you want to keep your tabs on all this stuff, I'm typing this in here, listen to Marketplace on NPR, National Public Radio, or if you got Sirius XM on your car, it pops on at 3 o'clock and 3:30 on Pacific time, right on your satellite receiver, because I get, that's my one little concession to luxury, is I kept up my little subscription for the Sirius XM, which is really handy when you're traveling around because there's always going to be something on. You don't have to worry about it. It's really quite neat. I listen to my old big band music and classical channel most of the time. But anyway, Marketplace is excellent. There's a Marketplace weekend as well. They've been on NPR for years. I think they started coming on in the 70s, and I started listening to them then when Rookheiser's Wall Street Week fizzled out when he died. Marketplace basically picked up the slack, and Kai Ryssdal, who is the current guy who's been on there now for quite a few years, he's excellent. The reporting is fair and balanced. They're very careful. They're meticulous. They keep their fingers on the pulse of a wide variety of sectors and normal working people and people trying to make their rent and trying to figure out what all the different factors are that affect up in the policy of things. And so I absolutely recommend Marketplace, that you can catch up on a hell of a lot. Have them in podcast form. Yeah, exactly. Bingo. And it's not something that requires, oh my gosh, I've got to take that half an hour out every day, or even pick up the slack and just do it a couple times. You will be informed, and you will find them entertaining and amusing, and you will find out stuff that will keep you going on stuff. And it means that the kind of gloomy panic that might occur for people who are just following some ideological source, whether it's somebody channeling Bernie Sanders or somebody channeling some right winger and the Rhino Trumpista party, this will give you the fair, reasonable skivvy on stuff. And so I use that as a measure at the moment. And I can also physically compare what they're saying about the economic world with what I can see. How many people are in stores? How many cars are out there? How many people are picking up food in the fast food place? How many people are doing things in theaters and venues? And so you can give a sense about how the economy is doing. And for the moment, it's humming along pretty damn good. And then, of course, the numbers come out for unemployment, for gross national product, and all the rest. We've still got very low unemployment, historically low. We've got modest economic growth. We've got the features in there that are not looking like a recession. And so there's still, cross fingers, a soft landing is theoretically possible. Do I think that the nutballs in the Republican Party are going to do any better than that? Well, we have a historical record to know they can't do that. We've had years and years. We know the limitations of the Reagan era trickle down, which all of that has exacerbated income inequality enormously. The Bush tax cuts that were put through were made permanent under poor Obama. So all of those reforms that should have been made during that period weren't done. And then it got worse with the 2017 tax bill that was funneling $1.7 trillion to people at the top. I don't think anybody in the Republican Party has the slightest clue about income inequality or what to do about it, if anything. And if you ask them about it, they get deer in the headlights mode. This is true of an awful lot of people when you do get to the point of asking questions. So there's my economic policy on thing. I've often jousted with people on Twitter. My view, I'd love to see the top rate income tax pushed back up, certainly to the 40%, 39.9 that Biden wants. That's very conservative. That's only Reagan era. But I would actually say that it should go up to 42%, which was under Clinton when we had budget surpluses briefly. And so all of that stuff is material that, as a believer in market capitalism, you can't have a vibrant market economy if you have too much wealth concentrated in too few hands. And at the moment, we've got a near banana republic distribution. And I don't see anybody in the Republican Party being able to drag kicking and screaming to pay attention to any of those numbers. Some of the stuff that's been on NPR and others, there's been studies done that most people, here's where you can find connection. Most people, and even 50% tax, I generally balk at taxes at that level. The one thing I can say historically is that it prohibitively high tax rates, the 80, 90% that was under the Eisenhower administration and that doesn't work, because people eventually figure out ways to avoid taxes. That's one of the reasons why the Beatles moved to the United States, because the tax rate was so bloody high in Britain during that period that why work at all if 95% of it's going to go to the government? And you're not exactly dragging in a huge amount of money. So I kind of balk at that 50% tax rate. And there's a way around that. Not having to have a terribly high tax rate. What we need to do as well is change the Social Security tax. Everybody's screaming bloody murder about the potential problems with the Social Security tax. There are programs and models that you can look at to do testing on it. If you decided to pull the ceiling off the Social Security tax so everybody pays it, so your billionaires are getting hit with a tax increase, but instead of it through the income tax, it'll be the Social Security tax, which means that will pull the pressure off of the demographic situation where there are fewer young people to support more old people, like old farts like me. And eventually other people will have that as well. We might even find the need eventually to have a graduated Social Security tax, but that would be a thing farther down the road. One of the reasons why I voted for Obama was that he made that point during his campaign that we should pull the ceiling off the Social Security tax. Now, he knew, and I knew, there wasn't a snowball's chance of getting that past the old farts in the Senate, let alone in the House, regardless of what parties were in charge. But nonetheless, I thought that was a correct policy, and I was glad to see that he had advocated it. He didn't make any big deal out of it once he was president. He focused on the healthcare thing first and got that through at least. And then by the time he could think about doing anything else in 2010, they lost control of the House, and there you were with John Boehner in charge. So you weren't going to be able to get any of that stuff, which is why you have to pay attention to who controls the House and who controls the Senate. So everybody, absolutely everybody, if they talk about senator, should remember, without the Senate, you don't get nutballs on the Supreme Court. Unless you can get them through a nutball Senate. So if the wrong party is in control of the Senate, you're going to get some really screwy people. And we've already seen with Dobbs, and who knows what other rulings are going to be coming down the line, that are going to be messing things up for decades. We'll survive. I'm a cockeyed optimist. I think the Republic will make it through, but it's not going to be as easy as it would have been if dumb rulings weren't made to begin with. In the same sense that we got over Plessy v. Ferguson, we got over Dred Scott, we got over some of these dumb rulings, but it took decades, a century or more in some cases, to resolve the matters in question. So isn't it easier not to have the dumb rulings to begin with? And that means you have to pay damn close attention to who controls the Congress and who is president and what are they going to nominate and who gets to pass what and how close the votes are as to whether certain conservatives are going to be able to put a veto on some of these things. So there's my little blip blop on that little part here. And we're getting close to an hour anyway, and it's still stuck at 82 here in the den. So I think we've got enough on that. Little old RJ has been ranting on about the history of it, but that's important stuff to deal with. That I wish more young people had had an awareness of what the causes of the 1970s inflation was compared to what the causes of this inflation was, which would cause them to understand that the Republicans who were posturing about this like mad a few months ago have no clue about any of this. I would constantly ask our various elected leaders, please put documentation up as to what you think the causes of the inflation are and what your bloody Republican policies are on it. Crickets on both ends. And so other than just saying, oh, we need to unleash the American things now, a lot of ifs in front of it, there's a chance of the Democrats taking both. Yeah, we know that the Republicans failed to get as big a gain in the midterms as they were expecting, and largely because of the impact of that anti-abortion Dobbs ruling. That certainly played a part. And so we'll kind of see what's going on. If the economy is moving along pretty damn good in 2024, Biden's going to be able to run on a good record, and proudly so. And then, of course, we've got a tiny little sidebar. Remember, Donald Trump is going to be $890 million poorer by 2024. That's how much of his debt comes due. A big chunk of it in 2023 this year. And it's very possible that's why he's scraping around like mad, both to pay his lawyer's fees, but also to meet that debt load in selling little trinkets and T-shirts with his little mugshot on it and all the rest. You know, I mean, he's scraping. And apparently sold at bargain basement low price Mar-a-Lago to convert it over to his son Eric. There may be some little tax finaglings on there, but remember, he buried his dead wife there on the golf course so he could get a tax break, and then forgot to keep the lawn mowed. They're a wacky little bunch in there. But anyway, it's going to be an interesting couple of years to go by. And if you listen to reliable sources like Marketplace and others to keep a pulse on things, and when people bring up economic illiteracy issues and political illiteracy issues and why certain policies that some ideologues might want to advocate are a bad idea, just like a third party is an area where, holy smokes, the elections are way too tight at the moment to have a third party presidential candidate. The Messiah himself could come down and run, and I would say, hold off, wait till later, because the election can get way too dicey on that. So Bernie Sanders has even come up with the thing that, no, this is not a good time for that to happen. So no one can argue about Bernie's left-wing credentials on that. So why would Stump start paying his lawyers now? Yes, absolutely. Well, when the dust settles, I suspect it's the case that they're going to discover that the lawyers that he's currently got made a point of being paid in advance. But that's going to be something reporters are going to have to fiddle on it. It's going to be kind of interesting. It's very difficult to burrow underneath that Byzantine world that Trump has. Oh, and that's another little minor detail that I would like to see the Congress pass, if we can ever get the people to do it, which is there would be an automatic release of income tax for all presidents, past and present, all people running for president or vice president. When somebody becomes Speaker of the House, their tax returns will automatically be released because they're third in line. When somebody becomes President of the Senate, as Mitch McConnell is now, their tax returns will automatically be released. And that's one way we'll be able to get Donald Trump's out of the way, because it'd be retroactive. And that way it would now become a thing when you file for a presidential bit, automatically the tax returns will be released. I think it's a reasonable thing to do. Who would be able to argue that elected officials shouldn't have that as the case? Let's see if they can pull that little puppy off. So we're now, Democrats, please make this part of the platform. Republicans won't dare to do that because they're a bunch of idiots now. They're Rhino Trumpistas. So, I'm an old Reagan voter that I look at these people and I'm going, holy smokes. Reagan would be drummed out of the Republican Party today if he were still around. And Lincoln, of course, holy smokes. Even calling them Republican is an insult to Lincoln now. So hasn't Mango Berlusconi been paying lawyers out of campaign funds? I'm not familiar with that case, but it wouldn't bloody hell surprise me. The fact that we've still got Orban in Hungary, we've still got Erdogan in Turkey, and of course you got Putin in nutball Russia. There's an awful lot of unpleasantries, and too much of our political landscape reminds me of the 1920s. Thank you very much. And that turned into the 1930s, which turned into the 1940s. And as I recall, that didn't turn out well for a lot of people. So I'd like to avoid that. 30 here in Johannesburg, just pulling it, had some power to go off now. Yeah, I think the situation there with running power problems has been kind of a recurring thing in South Africa. We've got other areas of where the electric grid in India, their coal usage is through the roof because they have too many coal-fired plants and they have a colossally inefficient electric grid. There would be another area on like foreign policy, international effort to rebuild the Indian electric grid to bring it up to speed for modernity would be a net, make it easier for them to meet their carbon goals on there. You'll never get that through in a Republican administration, but you would have a chance with it in future years in a future Democratic administration. Maybe a Pete Buttigieg, let's see what happens, a little farther down the road on that. So anyway, so we be living in interesting times, kids. I'll put the let me put my shameless plug thing of the advertisement for the book up. Okay, let me get around to do with that. Where are we? Let me shut off that little puppy. Where's my little sidebar here? And let me go over here and get my little rocks book thing up. Come on. Let's put that on pause. Okay, and then let's go over to that. I'm very slow with the stupid little mouse to get all the things to connect up. Pardonnez-moi. That's just the way it is. Okay, and let's get you going. Rocks for there, the book. Isn't it right pretty? Isn't it beautiful little thing? It's a very big book, and we're talking a big book. And it's meticulously documented. It's got a lot of funny bits because creationists are really dumbasses and there's a lot of humor in it. And meticulous sourcing that people can follow up on it so you can find subjects. Very thorough indexing. I'll be even more thorough in the indexing for volume 2. Away we go. There's always links to not only this, but Evolution Slam Dunk, my prior book solo, and the novels. We're about ready to get our little clickety-click thing. They're available at Spawn of Evil at Amazon, but you can find, I put the links to all 4 of the books out so far, fiction and nonfiction, in the video every year, every single episode. And so you can easily click on all of that. If you've got Scratch floating around, it makes birthday gifts, Christmas gifts, or people who like the fiction. Remember, the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg is a mystery, science fiction, Jules Verne, history. The history in it's very accurate. I have a lot of fun coming up with the little bits and pieces of things where you're dropped into the world of the past. And it embodies also my philosophy, which is secular, not magical, rational, reasonable. People shouldn't be a nuisance. They should have ethics and decency and a sense of humor. And all of that's playing out in the storylines. And I think they're ripping good yarn. So, and if you've got the extra scratch, a buck a month or more, however as you please, whatever your budget can afford. Don't spend a dime on me if you can't afford it, though. The link as well to the Patreon is one of the things that help us. The little screen I put up every time to show our dear patrons. Rocks there for Lavender Lady with her move. I didn't think I got to finish it reading yet. Yeah, it's a work that you can plow through at your leisure. Certainly got enough reading material in there. It's available in an ebook format. The one thing I discovered on that is that the info boxes that we do in the Rocks Were There aren't showing up properly on the ebook version. They're splitting up page by page, which I hadn't realized they did that. So DM Wing, one of the patrons for our work, called that to my attention. So I'll be doing a separate version for the ebook for Rocks Were There Volume 2 to keep all of the info boxes together as a unit so that when they're converted over to the ebook format, they won't split up that way. And that's a mindful little thing on that. I do pay attention to what people say. Yes, this is exactly the point. Everybody should take care of their own personal needs and things and whatever. But at any rate, for those out there that have a little extra scratch, or if they feel like getting some of the books for their local library, I donated the 2 novels to our local library, and donated, frankly, Rocks Were There, or Evolution Slam Dunk, but haven't got it cleared yet. It may not have met their editorial foibles. So much for that. But at least the 2 novels are available in the local library. So anyway, there's our shameless plug, and there's always links to all of that. And even if you can't get a thing yourself, let everybody know about it. Let everybody know about the books. Tell everybody that, hey, there's some neat stuff out there. And if you have the scratch, here it is, something you'd be surprised with. So donating books to libraries. Yes, that's we know how stressed libraries can be. We've got the nutcases. Look at Florida trying to put Prager University stupid videos in their educational system. Oh, we got a long haul to go to get source methods and everybody up to speed as much as possible on that. So here we are. We're past an hour. Everybody stay cool, stay safe, stay not drowned, stay not blown up, all the things that people need to do. And if there's any wooden penguins, probably avoid them. Okay. See you all next week, kids, and stay safe.